Hello everyone, welcome to Byjus Exam Prep IAS. Today in this session we are going to have the discussion on the newspaper of 30th of April 2024. So let's begin with the list of articles first. So these are the three articles that we are going to discuss in detail today. Now first is an editorial that we have regarding the EVMs, then something about the poultry industry that we also have in your editorial pages, and then lastly page number 8 has something related to the unclassed forests in India. So let's discuss these three in detail, and then after that there are 4 articles from the perspective of your prelims examination. First, warming of the Indian Oceans and a recent study that has been conducted about this. Then 2 from the business world, and then lastly the Chang'e 6 mission is what we are going to discuss. So these are the articles for today's news analysis. Let's begin with our discussion. So the first article that we have is this on page number 6 on your editorial page, and this is regarding the EVM-VVPAT judgment is disappointing. Now in this particular scenario, what we basically mean, what the author says in this article is that, and very interestingly, this article starts with a quote from H.G. Wells, and this is something that emphasizes the importance of statistical thinking for effective citizenship and equating its necessity to the ability to read and write. Now, historically what we have seen is that back in 1897, Indiana House of Representatives, it had passed a bill to set the mathematical constant, that is pi, to 3.20. They wanted the value of pi to be 3.20 based on a very flawed solution to a problem of squaring of circle, something called as squaring of the circle. And this is where it was by Edward Goodwin, and he claimed that there was a divine revelation because of which he wanted the value of pi to be taken as 3.20. Now this is something that happened, that instead of having it as 3.14, he wanted it to be 3.20 because that would have solved his problem. So meaning that you are saying that you want to change a formula because with your modified formula you can get the correct answer. So formula doesn't matter, your answer is correct. So this is what he went to pass a bill with. Thankfully it did not happen. Thankfully that did not happen because courts cannot decide. Courts cannot decide what science is, correct? So tomorrow, let's say a Supreme Court of India cannot say that, okay, Newton's laws of motion have to be this. We do not agree with the Newton's laws of motion. So that's why from tomorrow, Newton's law of motion will say something else, and these 3 laws of motion will not hold any value. So science cannot be determined by the judgments of the court, is what the author starts with. Now this episode, it serves as a warning against the misuse of legislative power in the scientific manners. The bill was eventually stopped in the Senate, and that was thanks to, you can say, intervention of another mathematician, that is C.A. Waldo. Now in this particular scenario, we need to understand the statistical principles that are important in legal and administrative contexts. And this article, that's why it argues that just as absurd a legislating the value of pi would be, it is equally nonsensical for the courts or the governments to impose an arbitrary standard in the scientific and statistical context without adhering to any of the established principles. Now this point is something that is illustrated with reference to the Supreme Court of India's handling of the VVPAT and VVPAT based audit of the electronic voting machines, where what we saw is that it prescribed an inadequate sample size for audit according to author, and potentially something that compromises the integrity of the elections. Now in this particular scenario, that's why the author points out that we need to understand the role of statistics in governance, that how exactly, just 1 minute please. For some reason I was unable to change the color of the pen. Yeah, so he talks about the role of statistics in governance, and that's why in this context, when it comes to what the ruling of the Supreme Court has been, he you can say in a manner is not completely in line with what Supreme Court has said. And that's why when we look at VVPAT based audit of EVMs, VVPAT ensures that votes are recorded as cast but not necessarily counted as recorded. Correct? Meaning that votes will be counted from where? The EVMs. And VVPATs, they are for verification. Correct? VVPAT will help in verification, whereas the EVMs, the vote would be counted from the EVMs. This is something that you know. So VVPAT ensures that the votes are just recorded as at cast, but it is not counted as recorded. Correct? It is not counted. This is not, the VVPAT votes will not be counted. Now in this context, what we know is that when it comes to this article also critiques the uniform non-statistical based sample size that has been mandated by the Supreme Court for auditing the EVMs, which it argues is too small for effective detection of any kind of malfunction or possible manipulation in the EVMs. And that's why it is risking the validity of the election results altogether, according to the author. And we have to understand that this process has been compared to a lot acceptance sampling in the industries, where a random sample is inspected to decline on an acceptance of the whole lot altogether. That, for example, let's say in an industry, let's say a product based industry, suppose that there is an industrial unit from where, let's say, soap manufacturing unit, all right, and there are 1000 soaps that have been manufactured from a certain industrial unit. Now out of these 1000 soaps, there are 5 random soaps that have been selected, and based on these 5 random soaps, we determine whether the entire lot was good or bad. So this is basically what is being also argued in this particular context, that proper statistical method should define the sample sizes and procedures in the VVPAT based EVM audits to ensure accurate and trustworthy election outcomes. So that's why basically this is what exactly it is saying, that when it comes to the lot acceptance sample, which we generally use in the industries, this is something that where in the industries it determines whether the complete set has to be accepted or rejected. So he said that here also something similar is happening, and this article, that's why it suggests that if any discrepancies are found in the sampled EVMs, a full manual count of VVPAT slips should be conducted for the affected population. And that's why when we talk about some of the areas of concern, the current approach of the Election Commission and the Supreme Court to VVPAT based audits is something that is criticized for not defining the population of the EVMs clearly, and for not having a clear protocol for what constitutes a defective EVM, or the effects that are supposed to be followed upon finding any defect as such. And that's why this article calls for a more transparent and scientifically valid sample process that would allow for, you can say, a near certain detection of any kind of discrepancy. That's why it also mentions a court case, Association for Democratic Reforms versus Election Commission of India, where we saw that the Supreme Court's judgment has been seen as a missed opportunity to address these issues. And that's why it criticizes the political figures who have demanded arbitrary sample sizes for audits, which lacks a statistical basis and could misuse or you can say it can mislead about the accuracy of the election results. And that's why we are seeing that it is being advocated for a robust and statistically valid VVPAT based audit system for the EVMs. And that's why it is recommended that such audits should be conducted at the start of the counting process to ensure that any discrepancies are dealt with very promptly and transparently, ensuring the integrity of the elections. So that's why this is basically what we are looking at, that the random sampling that has been suggested right now by the Election Commission and something that has been accepted by the Supreme Court. This is where it talks about that we have to take a more mathematical approach towards finding out whether any kind of problems are happening or if there are any defects as such in the EVMs. So we have to make a much better mathematical system or statistical system to find that out, instead of having a random 5 slips or 5 VVPATs here and there, where there is no basis on the basis of how many votes were counted or how many people participated in the election, what is the population size of a given booth. So there are all these things that should also be taken into account while taking these VVPAT units. So this is basically what the article also is suggesting. Now coming to the next article on page number 7, the poultry industry needs urgent reforms. Now right now what we have seen is that there has been another H5N1 outbreak, and this has brought to the forefront a long-standing concern regarding biosecurity and animal welfare in the industrial livestock production. So in this context, when it comes to this article, that's why this article brings in a very important fact, that we see that there have been a lot of problems and there have been a lot of concerns that have been raised with regard to biosecurity and animal welfare. Biosecurity and animal welfare. And the alarm bells have been ringing for over a decade about the conditions in these facilities. And this is something that emphasizes the need for a legal framework in India that aligns with One Health principle, which interlinks animal welfare with public health, ecosystem health, and biodiversity conservation. So that's why this policy has to be taken into account. So now that's why when we talk about One Health, when we talk about the principle of One Health, we have to understand that how exactly we need to link animal welfare, public health, right? Animal welfare, public health, and ecosystem health with biodiversity conservation. So ecosystem health, and then finally with biodiversity conservation. So we have to link all these together. Now when we look at the H1N1 virus, this is something that had first crossed over to humans from chickens in Hong Kong back in 1997, and the first case in India was reported in Maharashtra back in 2006. Now this virus has seen outbreaks in various different regions, including one in India that also happened in December 2020 and early 2021, which had affected approximately 15 states altogether. Now the virus's ability to cross species barrier is evident from the impact that it has even on the polar bears in the Arctic areas and the seals and the seagulls in the Antarctic areas. So that's why we have to understand how easily this virus has been able to jump this species. That not only the poultry, not only the birds, but we have seen that it has been affecting the human population, and so far so as it is also affecting the polar bears in the Arctic areas and the seagulls and the seals in the Antarctic areas. And the World Health Organization has estimated that 52% fatality rate is there for H5N1 in humans, with most of the cases linked to some very close contact with the infected birds or with contaminated environments. So that's why this becomes very crucial for us to understand that it has a very high fatality rate of 52% among the humans. Now when we look at the industrial farming concerns altogether, what we basically see is the cramped or unsanitary conditions that we have, in which the chickens are kept in battery cages, which they basically contribute significantly to the air and waste pollution problems in India. And these conditions are not only hazardous for the animals, but they are also very harmful for the environment and public health at the same time. The Central Pollution Control Board has classified large poultry units as polluting industries, requiring regulation compliances, etc. here. And although what we have seen is that these issues such as market volatility or contract farming and dependency on the antibiotics, it makes it very challenging for the farmers to maintain sustainable operations. And at the same time, one major problem has been about the antibiotic misuse as well. The use of antibiotics, including those classified by WHO as critically important, is prevalent in the poultry industry, and they are administered to even day to day, just a day old chickens as well, to prevent the disease. This practice, which contributes to antibiotic resistance as well, is very widely recommended despite known risks that we have. So that's why we have to understand that how exactly these kind of problems can be created. That we have seen that these practices, they contribute to antibiotic resistance and still are being recommended despite all these risks. And you will see that when it comes to WHO, misuse of antibiotics and overuse of antibiotics has been one of the very prominent reasons for the increasing cases of antibiotic resistance in the world. And this is where WHO has recommended, it's not only for public to realize that we, for example, we should not just randomly keep consuming antibiotics as and when we need, or just by googling about what our symptoms are and what kind of antibiotics we have to take, or just our friends suggesting us that okay fine, if you are facing this issue, just take this medicine, take this antibiotic, and you happily take it. So we, for humans, it has been very strictly said by WHO that we have to stop this practice, but at the same time for the animals also, WHO has recommended that for animals also, and especially in the poultry and livestock, this kind of practice has to stop. This kind of practice has to stop, otherwise we are moving in a direction where it will become very difficult for us to stop the cases of antibiotic resistance. Now, at the same time, there are some environmental and legal implications as well. The dense stocking of the animals, it leads to significant emissions. And that's why we see that it leads to effluent problems and a lot of waste accumulation, which impacts the local ecosystem and the communities. The manure which is used as fertilizers is very often it's something very often exceeds the land capacity, and it is something that leads to pollution and crop damage as well. And the conditions also violate the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act of 1960, as they cause unnecessary suffering to the animals. So that's why we have to understand that overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, they are causing significant environmental and health issues, and the non-compliance with the regulations have been they also have been a big challenge. So we have to understand what is our path to legal reforms. The 269th Law Commission of India report back in 2017 had recommended reforms for the poultry industry, including better living conditions and regulated antibiotic use to ensure safer food products altogether. And however, what we have seen is that subsequent draft rules by the Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare were criticized to be inadequate. And given the reclassification of the poultry industry as a major polluter and the ongoing public health crisis that we see, there is a very urgent call for strict oversight and enforcement of environmental and animal welfare in this particular area. So that's why we have to see how exactly it goes and where it goes, but we have to understand that this is something which has a lot of interlinking with public health and environmental health as well. So that's why we have to take proper care of this industry. Now coming to the third article, which is on page number 8, why are unclassed forests missing? Now this article basically is something that hovers around the compliance with the Supreme Court order that we saw on February 19th, 2024. Something that we have also discussed in our news analysis back then. Now, in this context, what we see is that the Supreme Court had directed the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change to publish state expert committee reports concerning the identification of unclassed forests. Now this order, it was a response to a petition challenging the Forest Conservation Amendment Act of 2023, which had suggested that unclassed forests, which were previously protected under the landmark judgment to 1996 landmark judgment of T.N. Godavaraman case, this is something that might lose protection altogether. Yeah, meaning that all these unclassed forests, these basically they would lose their protection, and this is something that has been suggested in the Forest Conservation Act Amendment of 2023. Now this Forest Conservation Amendment Act stipulates that these unclassed forests, which we, if you remember, we had discussed the concept of deemed forest. We had discussed the context of what we call as deemed forest. So I would suggest that you go back there and you also read about the deemed forest, the entire discussion that we had done after this judgment had come, and I think on 20th of February, and if I remember correctly on 26th of February, somewhere around that time, we had done this discussion on this entire issue. Now this basically is something that requires the central government's approval for non-forest use. I mean, when it comes to the deemed forest, so we had the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, and according to the 1980 Act, which what we know is that if you have a deemed forest, then there is a requirement of central government's approval for any kind of non-forest use of these areas. So what is the meaning of deemed forest? If you remember that we had discussed that these are areas which look to be forested, which look like a forest, which, I mean, if you were passing by, you would say that, okay, this is a forested area, but they have not been classified as forest in any of the official records. So that's why these are unclassed forests, or something called as the deemed forest. Now these unclassed forests, they include a variety of lands. For example, those owned by the government departments like the Forest Department, Revenue Department, Railways, as well as these are community and privately owned forests as well. However, the implementation of this act seemed to be flawed, because while the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change initially had claimed that these kind of state expert committees, they had identified these forests, and RTI response later had indicated that no such reports were available. And it was only after the Supreme Court's intervention that these reports were made public. And the published SEC reports, they depict a concerning scenario altogether, where we see that there is no verifiable data on the identification, status and location of the unclassed forests being available. And several states and union territories, they have either not constituted their state expert committees as such, or they have failed to align their reports with the court's directives. And only 9 states have provided the data on their extent of unclassed forests, and there is almost no specification of the geographical locations for these lands. And the reports also question the Forest Survey of India's data, suggesting the discrepancies in the reported forest cover. So that's why the broader implication of these findings are very, very significant. The apparent negligence in identifying and protecting the unclassed forests could lead to their destruction, or maybe this is completely in contradiction with the goals of the Indian forest policy and undermines the ecological security also. And we are calling, the irony of the situation is that we are calling this as Forest Conservation Amendment Act, where this Forest Conservation Amendment Act is allowing for these forested areas to be used for non-forest activities, meaning that tomorrow these unclassed forests, they might be available for use, and if you, let's say, want to own that land, you can just go and buy that land, just clean it up and do whatever construction you want to do, whatever infrastructure you want to build in these areas. And that's why the irony of the situation is that this is being called as the Forest Conservation Amendment Act. And that's why the hurried compilation of the SEC reports, largely based on either incomplete or unverified data, suggests a systematic failure to comply with both the Supreme Court's directives and the protective intentions of the Forest Conservation Amendment Act. And that's why this scenario calls for a very urgent governmental action to correct these oversights and ensure the preservation of India's forest heritage. Because otherwise, without you realizing, and before you can take any step, before any one of these agencies or governments can take the step, all these areas will be cleared off. And it's not the first time that's going to happen in India. You know about, if you know about the kind of ecological surveys that are done from time to time, the forest surveys that are done from time to time, and there is something which is called as the environmental impact assessment. You might have heard of it if you have read anything about it in the environment and ecology classes. Environmental impact assessment is something where we do the impact assessment of any upcoming project. So for example, let's say if there is a hydroelectricity power plant to come up in certain area, then before that a survey of that area will be done to ensure that we understand if there are any ecological or environmental repercussions of constructing this dam in this area. So for example, let's say if there are critically endangered species of plants and animals which reside in this area, then probably the permission to construct a dam in this area perhaps will not be given. So many a times whenever these kind of infrastructure projects are undertaken, before that environmental impact assessment will be done, and then a report will be submitted whether it has a clearance to go ahead with the with such a project or not. But many a times in the past it has happened, and we have seen this happen a lot of times, that unfortunately even though the EIA report suggests that a construction should not be done in this area, yet the constructions happen. And by the time somebody objects or the courts intervene, the things are done. So that is why we see that these kind of issues become a big challenge for the entire setup. There has been a case back in 2010. There was a cement factory, if I'm not wrong, a cement factory to be constructed in a forested area in Uttarakhand. And then the environmental impact assessment reports came in, and the report said that this area is not suitable for construction of the cement plant. Fine. But by the time the reports came, the constructions had started. Then it was challenged in the courts. Court said that the EIA report is correct, construction should not happen. And when the government officials went at the site to do the inspection, they saw that the construction of the cement plant was already over. So the report said that don't construct, the court said don't construct by the time the construction was over. And then after that, later the EIA draft rules come and they say that okay, if there is something that has already been done, let that be. But in future will not let anything happen. So just understand how the things unfortunately many a times are going in a completely negative direction than where they should be. So that's why we have to understand this. So that's why there were only 9 states, as I discussed, that provided the data on the extent of unclassed forests, and there is a lack of proper identification and protection of the unclassed forests, and that's why there is a risk that of their destruction, undermining the ecological security and the goals of the Indian forest policy. So that's why we have to take certain steps so that before it's too late, certain steps have to be taken. Now coming to the prelims based articles, the first article that we have is warming of the Indian Ocean set to accelerate according to studies. Now what we have seen is that when we look at certain data, and these data are not surprising anymore, and when we look at the data which has been collected between 1950 to 2100, we see that it includes significant warming and ecological consequences. So for example, temperature wise, from 1950 to 2020, the Indian Ocean has warmed by 1.2 degrees Celsius, and predictions for the period between 2020 to 2100 estimates an additional temperature rise of 1.7 to 3.8 degrees Celsius. So that's why right now what we have seen is that between 1950 or in the last 70 years, warming has happened by 1.2 degrees Celsius, and additional rise may happen between 1.7 to 3.8 degrees Celsius. Now there is something before we move on that I should tell you, that when you look at a figure like just 1.2 degrees Celsius, and you might feel that how does just 1.2 degrees Celsius make any difference? But just remember that we are talking about global average oceanic temperatures. And average temperature rise even by 0.5 degrees Celsius can be of huge consequences. So that's why 1.1 degree Celsius or 1.2 degrees Celsius or 0.7 or 0.5 degrees Celsius in a daily weather pattern might look to be inconsequential. But when you look at the average climatic temperatures, they have a significant, you can say, consequence for the environment, for the earth. So just remember that these are not inconsequential numbers. And that's why when we talk about that, if the earth warms by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius from the pre-industrial levels, then there will be permanent changes that will happen on the earth, and ecologically there will be a huge destruction of the flora and the fauna worldwide. There will be problems with the food security, with agriculture, the global economy would suffer, and everything will go south. So just by 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's why when you look at a daily weather pattern, 1 degree Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius may not be of any consequence for you. But when you are looking at global averages, 1 degree Celsius also is a big number. So currently what we see is that the current averages of 20 days per year of marine heat waves might increase to 220 to 250 days annually. Now that's why the frequency of the marine heat waves, which significantly influence the cyclone formation, is expected to increase dramatically. Currently averaging at 20 days per year, these events might surge to up to 220 days annually. So just understand the importance of the marine heat waves, because these marine heat waves are the ones that lead to cyclonic formations. They lead to cyclonic formations, and that's why the continuous warming is also likely to lead to tropical Indian Oceans to a state of near permanent marine heat wave. And this is something that will accelerate the detrimental effects such as coral bleaching or destruction of the seagrass or the loss of kelp forests which are there in these oceans. Because even kelp forests, for example, they are very, very important fishing grounds, or you can say also food grounds for many of the species which live in the ocean areas. And these changes pose a very severe threat to entire of the fisheries sector also. So that's why it will lead to things like coral bleaching, seagrass destruction, and loss of kelp forests, which can adversely affect the fisheries. Now, the study also has highlighted that the warming is not confined to the ocean surface but extends down to the depths of even 2000 meters. And that's why this deep sea warming, it contributes to a substantial increase in ocean's heat content, which has been rising at 4.5 zeta joules per decade and could accelerate to 16 to 22 zeta joules per decade. So that's why we see that this also is going to be of a huge significance. And this rate of increase in the heat content has also been linked to the energy release of you can say more or less approximately of the Hiroshima atomic bomb every second. So that's why or this is something that is continuing for a decade. So this is the kind of rise of heat that we are talking about altogether in this particular entire Indian Ocean region. And then at the same time, what we also have something about the sea level rises, that the increasing heat content also causes the ocean to expand, something that we call as thermal expansion. So this thermal expansion, this phenomena, this is responsible for more than half of the observed sea level rise in the Indian Ocean, which is more significant than the contributions from the melting of the glaciers and the sea ice. So that's why all these information, they become very, very crucial, because we see that there is thermal expansion thermal expansion which is being caused because of the heat. So you know that heat causes expansion. So this heat is causing expansion in the Indian Ocean, which is also leading to sea level rise. There is another contributing factor like the melting of the glacier or the melting of the polar ice caps. But apart from that, even the thermal expansion in itself is also a reason for the rising sea levels. So that's why there are all these things. So this entire information that we are discussing, this is based on the research that was led by scientists at the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology located in Pune, and it becomes a very, very important part of a chapter in the upcoming publication about Indian Ocean's role in the global climate system that is being written. So that's why these important points, I mean, again, look at when it comes to all these points, they become very, very important points from sometimes from prelims perspective, that what is causing what, but sometimes also we call these kind of points as fodder. They become fodder for your mains examination as well. They become fodder for your mains examination because let's say there is any question in your mains examination related to the warming of the seas, related to global climate change and the role of oceans in that, and what's happening to the oceans. So in that case, if those kind of questions come, some of these points that we have in highlights of these articles, they can be quoted, they can be used, because that solidifies the points that you are making. Instead of just writing generalized points like the oceans are getting heated, the Indian Ocean is heating, instead of that, if you say that Indian oceans have warmed by 1.2 degrees Celsius between 1950 to 2020 according to a report by Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, then in that case this is a very solid point, and with something that you have also given with examples. So then in that case, when you write these kind of points in your mains examination, it has a better value than just writing a generalized point that yes, oceans are warming. So that's why just remember that why these kind of points we also sometimes call as fodder for your mains examination. Now coming to the next article, increasing global uncertainties may impact exports. This is says FIEO. Now in this particular article, what we basically see is that the Federation of Indian Export Organization has noted very significant repercussion for the ongoing geopolitical tensions, particularly the Ukraine-Russia conflict, on India's trade figures. In the fiscal year of 2023-24, India witnessed a decline in export by 3.11%. 3.11% decline in exports. So this is what we have seen in 2023-24. Alright. So now this is something that amounts to almost $437 billion. $437 billion, and more than 8% reduction in the imports. So 8% reduction in imports. So that's why we have to understand that this is something that amounts to almost 677 billion. So we had discussed this in recent discussions as well. Now here what we have seen is that it has been highlighted by the FIEO Director General that the continuation of the global disruptions is likely to further depress the global demand. And this is something that could lead to this becoming very apparent. This is something that has become very apparent as though in the first quarter in the numbers itself. And it has been observed that the free trade also were softened, and suggesting that there is a potential downturn in the demand in the near future. And it has also been pointed out that relatively stable depreciation of the Indian rupee compared to the other global currencies, which only depreciated by approximately 1.3% against the dollar, lesser, which is something which is lesser in extent than the other counterparts like the Chinese yuan or the Thai baht or the Malaysian ringgit. So in all these cases, so that's why to support the exporters facing these kind of challenging conditions, it has been urged that the government has to implement measures to enhance the liquidity for the exports. And that's why it was emphasized that there is a necessity for expanding the financial support, as the demand slowdown could actually lead to a longer payment periods for the foreign buyers. And that's why it has also been advocated for a continuation and enhancement of the interest equalization scheme, which has recently received an additional allocation of approximately rupees 2500 crores by the Union Cabinet to support the exporters in obtaining competitive rates in the export credit. And that's why it was suggested that the rates under this scheme should be increased to 3% and 5% to better assist the exporters during these kind of turbulent times that we right now are facing. Now, another article that we have on the same page, that is page number 13 on your business page, don't take strong services export story for granted. Now, India's services exports, they have seen significant growth, increasing almost sixfold between 2005 to 2023, almost 6 times, right? So we have seen that India's services export, so 6 times increase in services exports, 6 times increase in services exports. Now, there is a potential for these exports to continue to grow and possibly reach even 800 billion by 2030. So right now it is where? Right now it is at 340 billion, and it might reach up to, if this continues, it might reach up to 800 billion by 2030. Now here, Goldman Sachs, they have highlighted that this growth trajectory contributes positively to India's GDP, with the services exports expected to rise in form of GDP. That right now it stands at 9.7% of GDP. Right now it stands at 9.7% of GDP, and this is basically 2023, and it might rise to up to 11% of GDP by 2030. So this is something that the experts at Goldman Sachs have said. Now, this increase, it could help in maintaining India's current account deficit at an average of just 1% of GDP between 2024 to 2030, assuming stable commodity prices and good trade balances. But Goldman Sachs warns against any kind of complacency regarding this growth. And that's why they have noted several challenges here. That there is a significant gap between the availability of skilled talent which is necessary for a sustained growth, particularly in technology related sectors. Alright, so that's why this is something that has been pointed out. So the issues that they have pointed out, the very first thing that they have pointed out is a gap in the availability of skilled resources. Alright, availability of skilled resources, or let's say skilled talent, availability of skilled talent, which becomes important for a sustained growth, and particularly in the tech sector. Then additionally, there is a considerable resource stress in major technological hubs as well. And for example, it has taken the example of Bengaluru, which hosts a large population of India's IT firms, and it is currently experiencing a water crisis. And that's why even this water crisis could mean that a lot of technological hubs may not be able to function properly in the absence of the required resources. So that's why it has mentioned water crisis. It has mentioned water crisis of Bengaluru as one of the problems. And Goldman Sachs also has pointed out the dual challenge of maintaining momentum in the IT services and leveraging the opportunities in the global capacity centers, because it underscores the need for improvement in education and training to ensure technological graduates are job ready and they can meet the industrial demands. So that's why it asks for improvements in education. Improvement in education and training. Let me just add this: education and training to ensure that the students coming out into the industries, they are job ready. They are job ready. That the students should be job ready. This is basically what it has asked for. So that's why, to ensure that whatever the industry needs, they are able to cater to that. And that's why the firm also suggests that there has to be a cautious approach to assuming continued growth in the services exports due to these kind of domestic and environmental constraints that we currently have right now. Then lastly, coming to the last article that we have in today's science page, China is all set for launch of mission for far side of the moon. Now what we basically know is that China is set to launch the Chang'e 6 mission to the far side of the moon and utilizing a backup spacecraft from its 2020 mission. Now first thing, what is the far side of the moon? You might know this, that when you look at the moon, the entire earth looks at only one side of the moon. Do you know this? That we never see the other side of the moon. Although the moon rotates and revolves, yet we are not able to see the other side of the moon. Do you know why? Can you tell me why? There is an exact concept which is responsible for that. Can you tell me in the comments what is this exact concept which leads to we seeing only one side of the moon, which is called as the near side of the moon? You tell me the name of the concept and we will reply and we'll give you the explanation, a very simple explanation of what exactly that means. So we see only one side, that is the near side of the moon. We have been until the poles, but going to the far side is something very different. Now in this particular scenario, Chang'e 6 mission will go to the far side of the moon, marking the first time in the series of these three complex missions which have been aimed at laying the groundwork for a crewed lunar landing and establishment of a base on moon's south pole. And this ambitious initiative, it builds on the momentum of China's lunar exploration programs, which had begun back in 2007 with the first Chang'e mission. Now Chang'e mission 1 was 2007, and subsequently we have seen other missions. And since then we have seen that they have significantly closed the technological gap that they had with the US in this. Now, in a very notable achievement in 2020, China had successfully received or rather retrieved the samples from the near side of the moon, and that marked the first time that such a retrieval has been done from the moon surface over 4 decades. And this mission demonstrated China's capacity to safely return an uncrewed spacecraft to the Earth from the lunar surface. Now the upcoming Chang'e mission Chang'e 6 mission rather, will utilize the backup spacecraft from the 2020 mission to collect the soil and the rock samples from the moon's far side, which faces basically the side that faces away from the Earth. And that's why there are significant communication challenges for us. And to overcome these challenges, the mission will rely on a relay satellite that was recently deployed to orbit the moon, and something that will support the spacecraft's almost 53-day mission. So this is going to be a 53-day mission. So that's why there is a relay satellite that will be there. There will be a relay satellite to support the spacecraft. Now after this, the future missions will be Chang'e 7 and Chang'e 8, which have been planned for 2026 and 28. So that's why this is very, very crucial that subsequently these two missions also have been planned, and this will focus on exploring the lunar south pole for water and indicating the construction of a basic outpost in collaboration with Russia. And these efforts, they are a part of China's broader goal to deploy astronauts on the moon by 2030. So despite the concerns expressed by NASA about the potential resource claim, China maintains its commitment to international cooperation, and this is something that also is evidenced by the inclusion of a lot of international payloads from other countries like France, Italy, Sweden, Russia, including Pakistan. So all these countries, they have taken payloads from all these countries as well, and which in a manner we can say that it shows that they want an international cooperation. But there is the other side of the thought process as well, that it is just a whitewash, because this is how China they would let you have your payloads in this mission, but ultimately they are the ones who are looking to establish a base on the lunar South Pole. So the Chang'e 6 mission, it aims to land on the northeastern side of the South Pole, which is called as Aitken Basin. This is where they are going. This is the oldest known impact crater in the solar system. And this area, that's why it has been described as the golden belt for lunar exploration, and it holds very significant scientific interest due to the potential for ice deposits, which could support long-term lunar bases by reducing the need for expensive resources being carried from the Earth. So that's why this mission not only aims to enhance our understanding of the moon's early evolution, but also tries to underscore the growing global interest and the investment in the lunar exploration. And this is something that has been highlighted by the recent missions from some of the other space agencies as well. For example, our own ISRO and some of the missions from NASA also. So that's why this is basically what we have in this article today. Now, this brings us to the end of today's discussion. I hope that this discussion was fruitful for you. Thank you very much for being here. I hope that these sessions help you, and please go back and revise these sessions as well. It will help you in prelims and mains examination. Some of these topics that we have spoken of, that we have discussed, are going to be very, very crucial. And finally, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel, comment on our videos, like the videos if you like our initiatives. So this is it for today's session. Thank you very much for being here.